35 ironworkers die at work each year. 2,200 workdays are lost every year due to injuries. Steel erection can be a dangerous business. Today we'll help you recognize hazards and work safely. The topics covered in this video will help protect you and your family from the tragic effects of a serious injury. Please, listen carefully. This video will help you to work safely, but up on the structure, only you can make the right decisions. Regardless of the amount of experience you have as an ironworker, you may encounter many types of hazards every day. Accidents can happen while you're connecting. The purpose of this video is to help you recognize and avoid dangers associated with connecting. Because connectors work at heights, they must be able to reach their work area safely. This means they should be trained in recognizing fall hazards while accessing their work area and while performing their work. We recommend that you watch the video on fall hazards training that is part of this series. That program covers the critical hazards that are found while working at heights. Our goal is to help you perform your job safely. This video is split into 3 sections. First, we'll identify the common hazards connectors face. Second, we'll go over safety measures to minimize these hazards. And third, we'll describe recommended practices to make double connections safely. OSHA defines connecting as the process of placing or connecting structural components or other steel materials using a crane or other hoisting device. Let's look at 5 common hazards that ironworker connectors should be aware of. The narrow footing and small space that connectors must work in can expose connectors to several dangers. These hazards can result in falls. There's always the potential that a tool or small fastener can be dropped. This can be very dangerous for those working below the connector. Incoming loads are sometimes difficult to control. You could be trapped between the load and the existing structure, causing a crushing injury. A swinging load could even knock you off the structure. Steel joists losing their bearing can also cause connectors to fall, not to mention the danger it may present to anyone working below. If a connection separates, you could be thrown off the structure or crushed by displaced members. Like joists, falling members can injure your fellow workers. Looking at the hazards and their dangers, 2 things become apparent. 1, connectors are often exposed to fall hazards. And 2, workers below depend on connectors to perform their job safely. Let's look at ways to minimize the hazards and decrease the likelihood of an injury to you or your coworkers. Be sure to pay attention to your footing at all times. Remember, any kind of minor slip or trip can turn into a long fall. In order to minimize the effects of a fall, it's important that you use fall protection equipment properly. Here's the basic standard. If connectors have fall exposure of more than 2 stories or 30 feet above a lower level, they must be tied off. If the fall exposure is over 15 feet and up to 30 feet, connectors must be supplied with and wear a proper personal fall arrest system in order to have the opportunity to tie off at any time. We strongly recommend that you take advantage of that opportunity. Your family will thank you for that decision. Remember that some employers or job sites have a 100% fall protection requirement. You should always check with your supervisor and know your employers and the specific job site regulations. Personal fall protection equipment can take many forms. It starts with the appropriate personal protective equipment and an approved full-body harness. This system is then attached to the structure by means of a lanyard and some type of anchorage point. Note that body belts for fall arrest are prohibited. For additional in-depth training on fall protection, review the fall hazards training video. When you're not using a tool, place it securely in your tool belt so it can't fall. Use caution so you don't dislodge tools from your tool belt or scabbard. Watch out for fasteners and other materials that were left on steel members. Stepping on them could result in a fall. Accidentally knocking them off can cause injuries to unsuspecting workers below. If you find these items, pick them up and put them in your bolt bag. This will help protect you and your coworkers. When you're up on a structure in position to receive a piece of steel from a crane, you must carefully evaluate the situation. Remember that hoisted materials can be unstable and difficult to control until they are properly attached. Watch carefully. You could be injured by a swinging load or knocked off the structure. Reaching too far for the member may also cause you to lose your balance and fall. In addition, there's always the potential that you could be caught between the existing structure and the incoming member. This could result in your being knocked off the structure, crushed, or both. Tag lines should be used where possible, and always maintain good communication with a crane operator. Clear and accurate hand signals reduce the chance for an improper movement of a load. Here are some important tips to follow. Always keep your hand and arm extended away from your body for easy viewing by the crane operator. Make clear, definite signals and only have one person signaling at a time. Remember, the operator has the right to stop the crane if poor signals threaten the safety of others. Talk with the operator before lifting and see how best to communicate. It's all about teamwork. If the distances are too great or you're working out of sight, make sure you use radios to maintain constant contact. This means talking to the operator with continuous, clearly spoken directions. If you aren't communicating with a crane operator, he should stop. The pride and care you take in your signals will make everyone's job safer and easier. Watch these signals and commit them to memory. Ask your supervisor if any are unclear or confusing.
Emergency stop. Both arms extended, palms down, move arms back and forth horizontally. Stop. Arm extended, palm down, move arm back and forth horizontally. Dog everything. Clasp hands in front of body. Swing. Point with a finger in direction of swing of a boom. Use main hoist. Tap fists on head, then use regular signals. Use whip line. Auxiliary hoist. Tap elbow with one hand, then use regular signs. Hoist. With forearm vertical, forefinger pointing up, move the hand in a small horizontal circle. Lower. With an arm extended downward, forefinger pointing down, move the hand in small horizontal circles. Move slowly. Use one hand to give any motion signal and place the other hand motionless in front of the hand, giving the motion signal. Raise boom. Arm extended, fingers closed, thumb pointing upward. Lower boom. Arm extended, fingers closed, thumb pointing downward. Raise the boom and lower the load. Arm extended, fingers closed, thumb pointing upward, move fingers back and forth horizontally. Lower the boom and raise the load. Arm extended, fingers closed, thumb pointing downward, move fingers back and forth horizontally. Retract boom. Telescoping booms. Both fists in front of body with thumbs pointing toward each other. Extend boom. Telescoping booms. Both fists in front of body with thumbs pointing outward. Extend boom, one hand. Signal with one hand. One fist in front of the chest with the thumb hitting the chest. Retract boom. Telescoping plumes. Signal with one hand. One fist in front of the chest, the thumb pointing outward, and with the back part of the fist hitting the chest. Bridge travel. Arm extended forward, hand open and slightly raised, making a pushing motion. Travel, both tracks. Use both fists in front of body, making a circular motion about each other, indicating direction of travel, forward or backward. Travel, 1 track. Lock the track on side indicated by raised fist. Travel opposite track in direction indicated by circular motion of other fist, rotated vertically in front of body.
In order to reduce the risk of joists losing their bearing, 2 criteria must be met before the joists can support any load, including an iron worker. 1, both sides of at least one end must be attached by either welding or bolting. And 2, required erection bridging must be installed. Many companies have begun to panelize joist bays on the ground. This method reduces fall exposure and, if planned properly, can be more efficient. For a more detailed review of proper installation of joists, we recommend you watch the SJI SEAA video on safe joist installation. Some connections have the potential of separating. This is especially true with double connections. Let's take an in-depth look at connecting safely. Before installing beams, the columns must be set properly. Prior to the column arriving, remove the top nut and one of the 2 washers on each anchor bolt. If leveling plates are being used, remove the top nut and the 1 washer. Note that if the correct number of washers or leveling nuts are not on each anchor bolt, notify your supervisor immediately. It's important that the anchor bolts be clean, oiled, and that the threads are in good condition. As the column approaches the anchor bolts, look up at the top of the column. Check for the proper orientation of the bolt holes. If anything looks wrong, immediately call your supervisor. Next, check the piece mark numbers for the specified direction. Delays are caused and hazards increased when columns must be picked back up and rotated. Always use clear signals to direct the crane operator when placing the column on the anchor bolts. Once the column is set, place washers on the bolts and snug tight the nuts. Then slowly slack the hoist line, check the column for stability, and cut the column loose. Recheck the tightness of the bolts before moving to your next task. If an anchor bolt turns as you're tightening the nuts, immediately call your supervisor. Damaged or loose anchor bolts can cause a column to fall over, injuring you or your coworkers. Any problems need to be addressed immediately. Once the columns are set, you must check with your supervisor to determine the starting point and which direction you're working. Delays occur when beams are positioned backwards or upside down. Removing and replacing these beams can also increase hazards. Piece marks should be visible on the top of the beam. So take the time to mark and lay out your pieces properly. In addition, double check to make sure you have the right size bolts in your bag. Once you're up on the building ready to install the beams, be sure to watch for beam ends not coped or missing bolt holes as the member approaches. Immediately notify your supervisor if there's a problem. Catching mistakes early saves crane and crew time and minimizes exposure to hazards. As a beam is swung in place by the crane, be sure to grab the beam or tag line and turn it into the correct position before the crane is boomed or swung into its final position. As the beam is lowered down between 2 columns, always place the far end in the column web first and hoist down on the crane to make your end. This will help align the beam at your end and may reduce binding. It also reduces swing, which could crush or knock you off the structure. Make sure you install a minimum of 2 bolts at each end or connection. Check that at least all the threads of the nuts are filled. Check with your supervisor ahead of time about how many bolts to place in cantilevered connections, such as splices in trusses or large horizontal members. You can mark the piece on the ground to help you remember. Now let's look at double connections. The new standard requires fabricators to provide one of the following three designs to help prevent accidental separation of members when making a double connection. This method uses three features: a notch in the clip at one end of the beam, an extra safety bolt hole in the other clip, and extra holes in the column. Now, when the first beam is attached at the column, the connector must install a snug tight third bolt besides the normal minimum of 2. This extra bolt is called the safety bolt. It must remain in place when the double is made. See how the notch allows the second beam to be attached without removing the safety bolt. This prevents separation of the connection. In this case, there are extra holes in the column and the clips on the end of the beam are offset. When the first beam is made, the connector must be sure to install the bolts that will not be covered when the second beam is attached. Again, the safety bolts must be snug tight during the connection. When the second beam is attached, the offset allows the safety bolts to remain undisturbed. This helps prevent separation of the connection. The safety seat provides both support for the first beam and an additional method of attachment to the column. First, the seat must be adequately bolted or welded to the column. After the first beam is inserted, it must be bolted to the seat, snug tight. If the double connection is to be made immediately, insert the second beam and attach using the shared bolts. If you're going to make the double later, install at least 2 bolts in the column before proceeding to your next task. Make sure all bolts are snug tight. These requirements represent a significant advancement in safety for connectors. However, it may take some period of time before all jobs are supplied with the required design specifications. Therefore, detailers, fabricators, and erectors must work together to help implement these standards. By proper pre-planning, all parties benefit. If these design specifications are not provided, contact your supervisor for safe procedures to make double connections. When it's time to add filler beams, you should place the correct bolts on the top flange of the carrier beam before the filler beam leaves the ground. As the filler beam is lowered into position, the hoist line should slowly come down until both ends of the beam are in place. Connectors should install 2 snug-tight bolts at each end before the hoist line is released. Make sure that at least all the threads of the nuts are filled. If you're working on a multi-tiered building, it may be necessary to splice the columns. For welded connections, the key is to maintain tension on the hoist until you fill in all the bolt holes using 1 washer and nut and the proper length bolt. For all other splices, slightly loosen one of the plates to allow the new column to easily slip into position. Do not remove the nuts completely. Then retighten the plate. Now install approximately 50% of the bolts in a staggered pattern. The correct length bolt means that after the nut is snug tight, all the threads of the nut are filled. A stick out of up to 3 threads is allowed. When the last nut is tightened, slowly slack the hoist line, look for column stability, and then cut the column loose. Let's review the key points we've covered today. First, we identified the 5 common hazards that ironworkers face. They included: 1. Ironworkers must often walk on and work in narrow spaces and at great heights. 2. Hand tools or small fasteners have the potential to be dropped. 3. Incoming loads may be difficult to control. 4. Joists may lose their bearing and fall. 5. Connections, especially double connections, have the potential to separate. Next, we looked at the OSHA standard. If you have fall exposure of more than 2 stories or 30 feet above a lower level, you must be tied off. If the fall exposure is over 15 feet and up to 30 feet, you must be supplied with and wear a proper personal fall arrest system in order to have the opportunity to tie off at any time. Remember that some employers or job sites have a 100% fall protection requirement. You should always find out what applies to you. Then we looked at ways to minimize the hazards. 1. It's important to watch your footing and use fall protection equipment. As a connector, you must wear an approved full-body harness. 2. Place tools securely in your belt. Watch out for leftover fasteners. If you find any, place them in your bolt bag. 3. Watch for incoming loads. Be careful you don't get caught between the structure and the swinging load. 4. Don't reach too far for the load. 5. Use a tagline where possible and maintain clear communication with a crane operator. Good hand signals or the use of radios will reduce the chance of an improper movement of a load. 6. To reduce the risk of joists losing their bearing, make sure both sides of at least one end are either welded or bolted. And all required erection bridging must be installed. This must be completed before any load, including an iron worker, is allowed out on the joists. Let's look at the proper procedures for connectors. When setting columns, first check the anchor bolts for the proper number of washers and nuts. Make sure the threads are clean, oiled, and not damaged. After the column is set, place the washers on the bolts and snug tight the nuts. Check the column for stability before cutting it loose. Call your supervisor if the anchor bolts turn while tightening. This is very important. Loose or improperly installed anchor bolts could cause a column or other members to fall over. While you're connecting, watch incoming members to see if they might be defective. If you're working with beams and columns, always place the far end in the column web first and hoist down on the crane to make your end. You must install a minimum of 2 bolts at each end or connection. Finally, we looked at 3 ways to reduce the potential of double connections separating. For a clipped-in connection, an extra safety bolt is installed in the bottom of the clip. This matches a cutout notch in the second member. Therefore, the first beam remains attached while the second beam is made. In a staggered connection, the extra holes in the column allow the beam clips to be offset. This means that each beam has at least 1 bolt that is not shared by the other beam. Therefore, the first beam remains attached to the column as the double is made. The third method makes use of a safety seat. This supports the first beam and allows it to be attached to the column. The second beam is then attached using the shared bolts. Remember, if you're going to make the double at a later time, install at least 2 bolts in the column before moving on. Lower the filler beam into position and install at least 2 snug-tight bolts before releasing the hoist line. For welded connections, you must fill in all the bolts before releasing the hoist. For all other splices, slightly loosen one plate and allow the new column to slip into position. Do not remove the nuts completely. After retightening the plate, fill in at least 50% of the bolts in a staggered pattern. Make sure all nuts are snug tight and that at least all the threads of the nut are filled. We hope you learned a few things today that will help you create a safer work environment. I thank you for watching this video. Your family will thank you for coming home safely day after day.